The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a cold November night in 1985. Bob Dylan was in his hotel room in Chicago, exhausted from another sold-out show, when the telephone rang with the kind of urgency that every parent fears. But this wasn't about an accident or an emergency. This was about something much more devastating. The truth. "Dad, we need to talk." The voice belonged to Jakob Dylan, Bob's 19-year-old son, and there was something in his tone that made Dylan's blood run cold. "Jakob, it's almost 3 a.m., son. What's wrong?" "Everything," Jakob said simply. "Everything is wrong, and it has been for years, but tonight, I'm finally going to tell you about it." What happened in the next 3 days would shatter Bob Dylan's understanding of success, fame, and what it really means to be a father. But more importantly, it would save a relationship that was one conversation away from being lost forever. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Bob Dylan's divorce from Sarah Lowndes in 1977 had been one of the most painful experiences of his life. Not because of the media attention or the financial complications, but because of what it meant for his relationship with his children. Jakob was only 8 years old when his parents' marriage fell apart, and in the chaos that followed, Dylan did what he always did when life became overwhelming. He disappeared into his music. For 8 years, from 1977 to 1985, Dylan had convinced himself that being a provider was the same thing as being a father. He sent checks. He called on birthdays and holidays. He invited the kids to concerts when his schedule allowed. In his mind, he was doing everything a divorced father was supposed to do. But Jakob Dylan was growing up, and he was starting to see through the mythology that surrounded his famous father. The breaking point came during Dylan's 1985 tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Jakob had been following his father's career in the newspapers and magazines, reading interviews where Dylan talked about his art, his philosophy, his thoughts on everything from politics to spirituality. But Jakob noticed something troubling in these interviews. His father talked about humanity, about connection, about the importance of authenticity and truth. Yet when it came to his own family, Dylan seemed to be living by completely different rules. That November night in Chicago, Jakob had made a decision that would change both their lives. He was going to force his father to confront the contradiction between the man he was on stage and the man he was at home. "Dad," Jakob said during that late-night phone call, "I've been thinking about something for months, and I can't keep quiet about it anymore." Dylan sat up in his hotel bed, sensing that this conversation was going to be different from their usual brief check-ins. "I'm listening, son." Are you? Are you really listening? Because I've been trying to talk to you for years, and I don't think you've heard a single word I've said." The pain in Jakob's voice was unmistakable, and Dylan felt something twist in his stomach. This wasn't teenage rebellion or typical father-son conflict. This was deeper, more fundamental. "Jakob, I don't understand what you're—" "You chose fame over family," Jakob interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. "You chose your career over your children. You chose being Bob Dylan over being my dad." The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. In all his years of facing critics, hostile audiences, and personal attacks in the media, nothing had ever cut as deep as hearing those words from his own son. "That's not true," Dylan said weakly. "I've always provided for you kids. I've made sure you had everything you needed." "Money," Jakob said bitterly. "You gave us money. You gave us a famous last name. You gave us the ability to tell people at school that Bob Dylan was our dad. But you know what you didn't give us? Dylan was afraid to ask, but he had to know. What didn't I give you? You, Jacob said simply. You didn't give us you, the real you. Not Bob Dylan the legend, not Bob Dylan the songwriter. Just Dad. Just a father who was present, who knew what was happening in our lives, who cared more about our problems than his next album. The hotel room felt like it was spinning around Dylan. He had spent decades writing songs about truth, about human connection, about the importance of authentic relationships. But his own son was telling him that he had failed at the most important relationship of his life. I thought, Dylan started, then stopped. What had he thought? That success would somehow make up for absence? That providing financially was enough? That his children would understand that his career was demanding and forgive him for the missed birthdays, the canceled visits, the phone calls that never came? You thought what, Dad? I thought I was doing what fathers are supposed to do, Dylan said, quietly. I thought I was building something that would benefit all of us. I thought the sacrifices were worth it. Whose sacrifices? Jakob's voice was getting stronger, more confident. Your sacrifices or ours? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we're the ones who sacrificed having a father so you could have a career. The conversation could have ended there. Dylan could have gotten defensive, could have hung up the phone, could have retreated into the justifications that had served him for 8 years. Instead, he did something that surprised both of them. He broke down completely. You're right, Dylan whispered, and Jacob could hear him crying through the phone. God help me, you're absolutely right. For the next hour, Bob Dylan, the man who had built his entire identity on being unreadable, mysterious, always in control, fell apart in front of his son. He talked about his own childhood, about his father's absence, about how he had sworn he would be different, but had somehow repeated the same patterns. He talked about the loneliness of fame, about how success had become a prison that kept him separated from everyone he loved. He talked about his fear that he didn't know how to be a normal father, that he was so used to being Bob Dylan that he had forgotten how to just be Dad. But most importantly, he listened as Jacob shared years of accumulated pain. The Father's Day cards that went unacknowledged, the school events Dylan missed, the times Jacob had wanted to call his father just to talk, but didn't want to bother someone so important. When the conversation finally ended at nearly 5 a.m., both father and son were emotionally drained, but something had shifted between them. Jacob, Dylan said as they were about to hang up, what do you need from me? Not as Bob Dylan, but as your father. What do you need? Jacob was quiet for a long time. I need you to choose us over everything else. Just once. I need to know that your children matter more than your next tour, your next album, your next whatever. I need to know that I have a father, not just a famous relative. Dylan made a decision that shocked everyone in his management team, his record label, and the music industry. He canceled the rest of his tour. 3 days later, Dylan flew to New York and showed up unannounced at Jakob's apartment. When Jacob opened the door, his father was standing there with 2 guitars and a simple request. Can you teach me how to be your dad? What followed was the most intense and transformative 6 months of both their lives. Dylan didn't just visit Jacob. He moved into the apartment next door. He didn't just call occasionally. He made himself available every day. He didn't just ask about Jakob's life. He became actively involved in it. But here's what nobody expected, including Dylan himself. Learning to be a father at age 44 was harder than any album he'd ever recorded, any tour he'd ever completed, any song he'd ever written. Dylan had to unlearn decades of habits. He had to stop thinking of every conversation as potential material for songs. He had to stop analyzing every interaction through the lens of his artistic persona. He had to learn to be present without performing, to listen without composing responses in his head. Jacob, meanwhile, had to learn to see his father as a flawed human being rather than an absent deity. He had to accept that Dylan was genuinely trying to change, even when those efforts were clumsy or incomplete. The breakthrough came about 2 months into their experiment in normal father-son relationship. Dylan had been trying to help Jakob with a personal problem, a complicated situation with a girlfriend, and Dylan kept offering advice that sounded like lyrics from his songs. "Dad," Jacob said, frustrated, "stop trying to be wise and profound. I don't need Bob Dylan's wisdom right now. I just need my father's opinion." Dylan was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised them both. "I don't know the difference anymore. I've been Bob Dylan for so long that I'm not sure who I am when I'm not performing." It was one of the most honest things Dylan had ever said to another human being. "Then let's figure it out together," Jakob said. "Let's figure out who Dad is when he's not trying to be anything except my father." That night, Dylan did something he hadn't done in decades. He played guitar just for fun, just for his son, with no thought of recording or performing or creating art. They sat in Jakob's small apartment, passing the guitar back and forth, playing songs they both knew, laughing at Dylan's rusty fingerpicking and Jacob's uncertain vocals. For the first time since Jakob was a little boy, they were just father and son making music together. But the real transformation happened gradually, in small moments that nobody would ever write about in Rolling Stone or chronicle in music history books. Dylan learned to show up for Jakob's softball games without bringing a guitar or talking to other parents about music. He learned to have dinner conversations about normal things, work problems, relationship issues, what movie to see on Friday night. Jakob learned to see his father's vulnerability, his genuine desire to connect, his willingness to sacrifice everything he thought mattered in order to be present for his son. The most powerful moment came 4 months into their experiment. Jakob had been quiet for several days, and Dylan could sense something was troubling him. "Son, what's going on? You seem distant." Jakob looked at his father, really looked at him, and said something that nearly broke Dylan's heart. "I'm scared that when you figure out how to be my dad, you'll get bored and go back to being Bob Dylan full-time." Dylan put down his coffee cup and turned to face Jakob directly. "Jakob, I need you to understand something. For 25 years, I thought Bob Dylan was the most important thing in my life. I thought that identity, that career, that artistic mission was what defined me. But these past 4 months have taught me something I never expected." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Being your father is the most important job I've ever had. It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do, and it's the only thing I've ever done that actually matters. Bob Dylan will be gone someday, but I will always be your dad. And I never want to confuse those priorities again." Jakob started crying, not the angry tears of their phone conversation 8 months earlier, but tears of relief and recognition. "I was 8 years old when you and Mom got divorced," Jakob said. "I spent 11 years thinking that I had lost my father forever. I thought Bob Dylan had eaten my dad alive, and there was nothing left of the man who used to read me bedtime stories." "I thought that too," Dylan admitted. "I thought I had to choose between being an artist and being a father. I thought success meant sacrificing personal relationships. I was wrong about everything." The 6-month experiment officially ended in May 1986, but the relationship they had built continued for the rest of Dylan's life. Dylan restructured his entire approach to touring and recording, making sure he was available for the important moments in his children's lives. He attended Jacob's wedding. He was there when his grandchildren were born. He learned to separate Bob Dylan, the public figure, from Bob Dylan, the father and grandfather. But perhaps most importantly, he discovered that being present for his family didn't diminish his artistry. It enhanced it. The songs Dylan wrote after 1986 had a depth of emotion and authenticity that critics and fans noticed immediately. Songs about loss, love, redemption, and the complexity of human relationships. Songs that could only have been written by a man who had learned to be vulnerable, present, and real in his most important relationships. Jakob Dylan went on to have a successful music career of his own with the Wallflowers, but he never forgot the lesson of those 6 months when his famous father chose to be just dad. In interviews years later, Jakob would say, "My father taught me that success means nothing if you lose the people who matter most. He also taught me that it's never too late to choose love over ambition, presence over performance, and authenticity over image." And Dylan, in his rare moments of personal revelation, would acknowledge that the phone call that nearly broke his heart ended up saving his life. "Jakob taught me that being a father isn't about providing or protecting or even loving from a distance," Dylan said in a 1995 interview. "It's about showing up. It's about being present. It's about choosing your children over everything else, not just once, but every single day." The story of Bob Dylan and Jakob Dylan reminds us that success, fame, and artistic achievement are meaningless if they come at the cost of our most important relationships. It reminds us that it's never too late to change, to choose differently, to prioritize what actually matters. Most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones brave enough to tell us the hardest truths about ourselves. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we're brave enough to listen. If this story of redemption, second chances, and the power of choosing family over fame moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories about music legends and the personal transformations that changed their lives forever.